I'm Mark Lewis, and this is the third in a series of teachings related to the Jewish Gentile controversy. If you remember from the previous lectures, um, we zeroed in on a passage which we haven't looked at in depth, but we provided the background for, in Acts 15:5, where it says that certain ones of the sect of the Pharisees stood up and said to a church council, the first church council ever in Jerusalem with the apostles there and all the leadership of the church, and they said, we must have the Gentiles who are coming to Christ be circumcised and keep the law of Moses. So anyway, we're going to look at that in the next section. We're going to actually go through Acts 15 verse by verse. But in the last two sessions, we introduced the subject, talked about how it was important, and in the last session, we went through the scriptures in the Old Testament where it highlighted how the Jews were special. They were chosen, and how that was embedded in their DNA, that was like a flashing red sign put on their forehead. As far as their collective psyche, that they were God's chosen, and therefore they had to be separate from the rest of the world, and specifically Gentiles. And we identified many ways where God, various commands and practices that he had them do, that kept them separate. And so the divide between Jew and Gentile was far greater than any people group. I think I'm safe to say that. It was very, very substantial. It was very, very significant. And it was a matter of training and formation over generations to make the Jews think and understand that they are different. So, I said that this session we would look at the Old Testament prophecies about Gentiles, because looking back, we know that Jesus Christ himself said when he left, I want you to make disciples of all nations. In other words, it's been in God's heart and plan since the beginning to recapture the whole world, not just Jews. In fact, in the very story of Adam and Eve and their fall, when God said, from your seed will come one who will crush the head of the serpent, it was a worldwide promise to set us free, both Jew and Gentile. So anyway, and that's re-articulated in various places. But what I want to do is I want to look at specific passages that are prophecies now about the Gentiles, that call the Gentiles specifically out. Now, we as Christians, Gentile Christians I might add, often go back to the scriptures in the Old Testament, and we read back into passages and identify ourselves with those passages. And really there's nothing wrong with that per se, but the truth is they weren't intended for us. And if you step back and look at them objectively, they're for Jews. Most of the admonitions, most of the instructions, even most of the promises were really for Jews. We have to kind of do a little bit of finagling, messing around, so to speak, with the text to make them apply to us. There is a way in which they apply to us, but not directly, not explicitly. The scriptures in the Old Testament are almost entirely about the Jewish people and written to the Jewish people. If you would have told a Jew at any time in the past, well, for everything before Christ, and say this pertains to the Gentiles too, they would look at you like you're crazy. No, they understood. It's for them. So anyway, let's look at some of these passages because there aren't very many of them. And before we go on, let me say this. There are more passages than what I have got here But many of them talk about judgment coming on Gentiles. And you remember how I said that people, if you have a young boy or a girl who dresses differently or acts differently on the playground, they often set themselves up for abuse by bullies. We participate as human beings in kind of a group think, and those people who are different, they tend to be discriminated against. And so it's always been with the Jews. They stick out wherever they go like a sore thumb. So they experience and have experienced through the generations umpteen amounts, including even the present day, injustices by us who are Gentiles because they're so different. They look different, they act different, they're different. And we as human beings don't usually favor different. So there are passages that talk about, and we agree in our hearts with, that say that God on the last days is going to come down to Jerusalem and he will wreak vengeance on the Gentiles who persecuted the Jews. And that makes sense. It makes a lot of sense, really, if you look at it. It is right that God wreak justice on those who so cruelly tormented the people, and the Jews certainly have been. But I'm going to set those aside and not really look too much at those. And the reason is because there's no surprises there. I mean, whether you're a Jew or a Gentile, that makes sense. I want to look at the passages that kind of, well, from a Jewish perspective, seem peculiar and out of place and even puzzling. So let's go on. Let's start in Isaiah 2. Now there's patterns to all these, and I may not say anything about them as I go, but toward the end I'll try to summarize it. I'll try to highlight things that I particularly want you to notice. But Isaiah, and many of these are very familiar. Isaiah 2, verse 2. In the last days, make note of that, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as chief among the mountains. It will be raised above the hills, and all nations will stream to it. Whenever you see nations, remember, think Gentile. All Gentiles will stream to it. Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, so that we may walk in his paths. Now, these are Gentiles saying this, okay? The law will go out from Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He will judge between the nations and will settle disputes for many peoples. They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. If you look carefully, it sounds like the Gentiles want it this way. This is not a forced proposition. Let us do this. We want to do this. Let's go up to the house. They will be streaming to it. They will want it. This is not a forced thing. It's not like Allah, where Allah has made a command, conquer the nations by sword or whatever. It forced them to. No, this is not the kind of talk. But it's in the last days. Note that. Now look at chapter 11 of Isaiah. And, we could spend all day talking about these, and I can't afford to do that. But we'll take a short, brief visit of some of the highlights. In that day, the root of Jesse will stand as a banner for the peoples. The nations will rally to him, and his place of rest will be glorious. In that day, the Lord will reach out his hand a second time to reclaim the remnant that's left of his people from Assyria, Lower Egypt, Upper Egypt, Cush, Elam, Babylonia, Hamath, and from the islands of the sea. He will raise a banner for the nations and gather the exiles of Israel. He will assemble the scattered people of Judah from the four corners of the earth. It's here it has to do with the Messiah. It's the end time. And they rally to him. And part of the same kind of thing, and this will be repeated in several passages, is that God's people have been scattered, the Jews have been scattered all over the earth. And this time, when the nations will stream to them, they will bring with them all these exiles from all over the world. Yeah, we'll find that out more. How about Isaiah 42, 1 through 4? A lot of these are in Isaiah, not all of them. 42, 1 through 4. Here is my servant whom I uphold, my chosen one in whom I delight. I'll put my spirit on him, and he will bring justice to the nations. Read Gentiles. He will not shout or cry out or raise his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not snuff out. In faithfulness he will bring forth justice. He will not falter or be discouraged till he establishes justice in all the earth. And in his law the islands will put their hope. Well, of course, this is referring to the Messiah. But what's amazing to me, this isn't about warring on him. This is tenderness. A bruised reed he will not break. He won't even shout or cry out. And he will, in his law, the islands, which are far away, is kind of in the ancient world, the islands were far away, as far away as you could go. They will wait. They will put their hope in him. So it kind of makes you scratch your head if you're a Jew. How is he going to do this? How is he going to do this? This sounds like some fantastic propaganda machine he must have. But it's going to be the Messiah. Let's see. Let's go to 49. Chapter 49 of Isaiah, starting in verse 1. Listen to me, you islands. Hear, you distant lands. Before I was born, the Lord called me. From my birth, he's made mention of my name. He made my mouth like a sharpened sword, and in the shadow of his hand he hid me. He made me into a polished arrow and concealed me in his quiver. He said to me, you are my servant, Israel, in whom I will display my splendor. But I said, I've labored to no purpose. I've spent my strength in vain and for nothing. Yet what is due me is in the Lord's hand, and my reward is with my God. And now the Lord says, he who formed me in the womb to be his servant, to bring Jacob back to him and gather Israel to himself. For I'm honored in the eyes of the Lord, and my God's been my strength. He says, that is God. It is too small a thing for you to be my servant, to restore the tribes of Jacob, and to bring back those of Israel that I've kept. I will also make you a light for the Gentiles, or the nations, that you may bring my salvation to the ends of the earth. This is what the Lord says, the Redeemer and the Holy One of Israel, to him who was despised and abhorred by the nation. What nation? Oh, Israel. To the servant of rulers. Kings will see you and rise up. Princes will see and bow down because of the Lord who's faithful, the Holy One of Israel who has chosen you. If I was a Jew right now, I'd have a headache. Because whoever this is, and it's not Israel, it's one who's going to restore Israel, but he's also going to restore and give salvation to Gentiles. And he's a servant of rulers. This is just this just does not fit anything. This is something definitely unusual and weird. And then chapter 52 of Isaiah, starting with verse 13. See, my servant will act wisely. He will be raised and lifted up and highly exalted. Just as there were many who were appalled at him, his appearance was so disfigured beyond that of any man, and his form marred beyond human likeness. So he will sprinkle many nations or Gentiles, and kings will shut their mouths because of him. For what they were not told, they will see, and what they had not heard, they will understand. Who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? And it goes on. And you recognize all these passages. They have to do with the suffering Messiah. But it says he will sprinkle the nations. He will sprinkle the Gentiles. What does that mean? Well, sprinkling in the Jewish world was a way of washing you clean of filth, of immorality, of failure, of sin, it was a purification so that you could be holy. Well, let's see. Let's go to Daniel 7. Ezekiel, Daniel. Just bear with me here. I hope that this is not boring. It sure shouldn't. But, you know, you might say, oh, I wish he'd hurry up and get to the point. Well, trust me, this is an important part of the point. Daniel 7:13. In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man. Coming with the clouds of heaven, he approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All peoples, nations, and men of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. So that includes Gentiles, right? Yeah, obviously. I'm going to pass over the one in Amos 9 because basically the gist of it is God says, I will raise up the fallen tabernacle of David, and the rest of the Gentiles who are called by my name will then turn to the Lord. There's various ways of translating it, and I think when it's quoted in Acts 15, it's from the Septuagint of that time. But anyway, it talks about the Gentiles turning to God also in the last days. Micah 4. Micah 4. Micah 4, verse 1. In the last days, this sounds very familiar. In the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as chief among the mountains. It will be raised above the hills, and the peoples, Gentiles, will stream to it. Many nations will come and say, let's go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways so that we may walk in his paths. It talks about they'll beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Then turn to chapter 7 of Micah, down to verse 14. Shepherd your people with your staff, the flock of your inheritance, which lives by itself in a forest, in fertile pasture lands. Let them feed in Bashan and Gilead as in days of old, long ago, as in the days when you came out of Egypt. As in the days when you came out of Egypt, I will show them my wonders. Nations will see and be ashamed. Deprived of all their power, they will lay their hands on their mouths, and their ears will become deaf. They will lick dust like a snake, like creatures that crawl on the ground. They will come trembling out of their dens, and they will turn in fear to the Lord our God, and will be afraid of you. Who is a God like you, who pardons sin and forgives the transgression of the remnant of his inheritance. All right, Zephaniah 3:20. You can skip over Zephaniah pretty easily because it's pretty short, but 3:20. At that time I will gather you. At that time I will bring you home. I will give you honor and praise among all the peoples of the earth when I restore your fortunes before your eyes. All right. Zachariah. Now this is the last. Zachariah 2. There's a few in Zachariah. 10. 2:10. Zechariah 2:10. Shout and be glad, O daughter of Zion, for I'm coming, and I'll live among you, declares the Lord. Many nations will be joined with the Lord in that day, and will become my people. Let that sink in. I will live among you, and you will know that the Lord Almighty has sent me to you. The Lord will inherit Judah as his portion in the Holy Land, and will again choose Jerusalem. Be still before the Lord, all mankind, because he's roused himself from his holy dwelling. Chapter 8 of Zechariah, verse 22. Let's start with verse 20. This is what the Lord Almighty says. Many peoples and the inhabitants of many cities will come, and the inhabitants of one city will go to another and say, let's go at once to entreat the Lord and seek the Lord Almighty. I myself am going. And many peoples and powerful nations will come to Jerusalem to seek the Lord Almighty and to entreat him. This is what the Lord Almighty says. In those days, 10 men from all languages and nations will take firm hold of one Jew by the hem of his robe and say, let's go with you, because we've heard that God is with you. And chapter 9. This will be the last one I'll read to you. Zechariah 9, verse 9 through 10. Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, daughter of Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and having salvation, gentle and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. I will take away the chariots from Ephraim and the war horses from Jerusalem, and the battle bow will be broken. He will proclaim peace to the nations, Gentiles. His rule will extend from sea to sea, from the river to the ends of the earth. So, how strange, how peculiar this is. So over and over, you get the idea he's winning the Gentiles to himself, but not through war. In fact, in this case, his dominion's going to be worldwide. But the strangest thing, what a strange king he is, he rides on a young donkey instead of a war chariot. And not only that, but you'd think if he was going to conquer the kingdoms of the world, that he would need a bow, and he would need war horses, and he'd need chariots, but he's outlawing. If I was a Jew, I would have a headache, I'm pretty sure. Because all these passages seem to point to the end of the days, the last days, and they seem to point to the Messiah. And it seems as if that somehow he's going to reach and be loved by the Gentiles, by the nations. They're going to be running to him. He's not going to force anybody. There's no forced conversions. And so you wonder, how is this going to happen? How could this happen? This seems all wrong. I mean, wreaking justice on the Gentiles makes good sense if I was a Jew. I mean, because they persecuted you, they harassed you, and there's going to come a time when it says in many places, he'll gather in Jerusalem all the nations, and he will execute justice. That makes sense. This other stuff doesn't make any sense. I mean, in a way, it's weird. It's just, put yourself in a first century Jewish mind who's been trained all your life to think that you were God's chosen, God's special one. The very idea that he would extend favor, salvation, and have a relationship where he's loved by the Gentiles, that's kind of uncomfortable. That's kind of uncomfortable if you're a good Jew. That's kind of uncomfortable. You wonder, how can that be? How can that happen? How can Gentiles run to God? How can they want to be with God? How can they... Yeah, that's a weird one. Now, I want to just kind of change subjects just slightly. I'm kind of late on my time. I want you to notice Moses, the prophets, never call the Jewish people to convert us Gentiles. You won't find it. That's secondhand to us Christians and even to Muslims. But the Jewish people don't feel that. They don't feel that pressure at all. Never have. They weren't called. They were never called. They were called to be priests. They were called to be a light, to be a witness, but in a passive sort of sense. The nations would come to them. And that's what we just read in the passages we saw. Nations would come to their light. But they weren't chasing the nations down. God never commissioned them to convert the nations. So it makes you wonder, how is this going to happen? You know it's going to have to do with the Messiah in the last days, of which Peter says we are in the last days in his Acts 2 sermon. He says these are the last days, beginning now, when the Holy Spirit fell. So we're in the last days. The Messiah has come. But from a Jewish perspective, God didn't exactly map out the strategy explicitly. How are these Gentiles going to come to God? They clearly are. It's clearly not just going to be Jews standing on in the last days with God and God alone. Gentiles are too. God is going to reach the whole world. How is he going to do that? That's the question. That was the puzzling thing. And in part, that's what the church was debating in Acts 15. See you next time. We'll be talking more about it.